I'd like to pick up today where we left off last time with our discussion of the animal kingdom. And we were discussing the protostomate animals, and so I'd like to continue that discussion with the phylum Mollusca. So the common name for the mollusks are the soft-bodied animals. It includes animals such as snails and slugs, clams, also octopus and squid would be in this group as well. And one of the characteristics of the phylum is that members of the phylum exhibit a swimming larval stage known as a trochophore larva. And so the trochophore larval stage, as you can see here, has kind of a distinctive ring of cilia around the mid portion of the organism. And again, it will eventually go through a metamorphosis into this diversity of groups that we know as the mollusca. In the adult forms, we generally see certain characteristic structures as well in this kind of generic-looking example of a mollusk. One of the structures is a radula. And so the radula is a rasp-like structure that's used for feeding. It's typically rasp-like anyway, a chitinous structure. And they'll use that for scraping off vegetation, or in some cases even predators will use that for rasping through the shells to prey on other animals. So anyway, so the presence of a radula is one characteristic of the group. They also possess a mantle, and the mantle is basically a muscular wall here. And the mantle in many species will produce and secrete a shell. So a lot of the mollusks have shells to protect them because they are quote unquote these soft-bodied animals. So the mantle then is again a muscular wall in which some produces a shell, and that can be an external shell or an internal shell in some cases. They also have a muscular foot that they use for locomotion. So again, in the case of a slug or a snail, they're actually going to be crawling on that, but it can be highly modified, for example, into the arms of an octopus or a squid. And then also a visceral mass, and what that means is that they have well-developed organs. So we are now seeing heart, we're seeing well-developed nervous system, organs associated with the digestive tract and so on. So again, also have this quote-unquote visceral mass associated. As we look at classes and examples of mollusks then, one class would be the gastropoda, and the name is trying to tell us that they are the stomach-footed animals, and that's what the name means. And examples would be snails and slugs would be members of the gastropod. So they basically are crawling along on a muscular foot on their stomach. And the Polypsopoda, also called the bivalvia, are clams, oysters, mussels, and their relatives. And again, bivalvia is trying to tell us that they do have these two shells. Polypsopoda means spade-footed animals. So many of them actually have a muscular foot that they use for digging down into the sand. The Polyplacophora, common name are the chitons, are a very common tide pool animal, and the name means many-plated. And so you can see here that they have these 8 overlapping shells on their dorsal surface, and they will attach to rocks and basically feed on algae on the rocks. And then still another group are the cephalopoda, and these are the so-called head-footed animals, but this includes octopus, squid, chambered nautilus, and cuttlefish would also be in this group. And again, this is a very interesting group because these animals are actually highly intelligent and are considered the most intelligent invertebrates. They are actually capable of some complex learning. So again, a very diverse group within the mollusca. Now, the next phylum I want to discuss, still within the infrakingdom Protostomia, are the annelids. And the common name for the annelids are the segmented worms. Now, the annelids are close relatives of the mollusks, and they also exhibit that trochophore larva, that swimming larva stage. And they also exhibit both external and internal segmentation. So segmentation, again, is something that we see in this group. We see it in other groups as well. And again, in the Annelida, we actually seek a wall that separates one segment to another. And the term segmentation actually refers to embryonic development. And what happens here is that in certain stages of the embryonic development, cells aggregate into clumps, basically. And this helps organize the head end of the animal from the tail end of the animal. And it also, in this stage, the animals will decide essentially what organs will be developed in which part of the animal, also what appendages may be developed in a particular section or segment. So segmentation is something that we've actually seen already in the arthropods, although I didn't really mention it at that time. And again, we see here in the Annelida, and we will see in virtually all the rest of the animals that we discuss. So sometimes segmentation persists to adulthood, sometimes it's both external and internal segmentation, sometimes it's just internal segmentation, but segmentation is a fairly advanced characteristic that we see in the animal kingdom. Okay, and then last but not least, in members of the Annelida, most members will have small bristles, sometimes small, sometimes large, but basically bristles that are called setae or chaetae that help them basically in locomotion and moving. And so I'd like to show you a real brief animation actually of of an earthworm. And again, what these setae do is actually provide traction. And I don't know if you've ever seen an earthworm crawl, but they're kind of flattened on their ventral surface or their belly surface. And so these, in fact, you may never even notice that they have these tiny bristles, but again, in the earthworms, they actually have tiny bristles. And some other members of the annelid, the bristles will be quite a bit bigger. All right. So as we look at classes of annelids then, one class are the oligochaetes, and this is the earthworms, and what the name is trying to tell us is that they have few bristles. So the earthworms have relatively few or very small bristles actually, but they are a member of the annelids. Another class of annelids are the polychaetes, and within the Annelida, by far, the polychaetes are the most abundant of the annelid worms. And again, they're also a very abundant animal, probably one of the most abundant animals that you've never seen or never heard of. And so polychaetes tend to be marine organisms, and you can see here that they generally have larger bristles, and they have these usually fleshy appendages as well, known as parapodia. So the parapodia increase surface area, help with oxygenation of their blood, and then also help with locomotion or swimming through the water. So typically the parapodia are fleshy, but they may also have bristles associated with them. So the term polychaete is telling us that they have many bristles. And again, a very, very diverse group. Find them in marine sediments, basically from the Arctic to the Antarctic and everything in between. And then the last class are the Hierodinea, which are the leeches. And leeches, of course, are ectoparasites. And I don't know if you've ever seen leeches up close, but they are segmented. They look actually a lot like an earthworm. If you see them move, they kind of move like an earthworm. It's just that instead of being an animal that lives in the soil, eating the soil pretty much is what earthworms do, this is an ectoparasite, a blood-sucking animal. Okay, another phylum within the Protostomia are the brachiopods. And the brachiopods really are not that numerous today, but they at one time were a very numerous animal. And what distinguishes them is that they have a specialized feeding structure called a lophophore that they use for filtering water. They generally have two shells like clams, but the shells will be suspended on a pedestal or a stalk. So they actually are suspended above the surface. So here's a picture of the lophophores that they extend out for feeding. And again, what they will do is filter feed. These are ciliated. They capture particles or small prey, take those to their mouth, and then will digest them there. And again, they do have two shells, so superficially they look a little bit like mollusks, but again, they develop very differently, and the lophophore structure is unique to them. And then also what we can't see is back here, leading down, they actually have this structure called a pedestal or stalk, which suspends the shells above the surface of the sediments in which they live. And so again, these are primarily marine organisms living in oceans and seas. Okay, next then I want to move into our last infrakingdom, which is the infrakingdom Deuterostomia, or the so-called deuterostomates. And the deuterostomates take their name from the fact that the anus forms from the blastopore. So going back to that gastrulous stage, that first opening that forms the gut then becomes the anus rather than the mouth. Again, they will have an open digestive system. So again, as we look at this embryonic development in the gastrulous stage, that first opening is the blastopore, and the protostomates that will develop into the mouth, and in deuterostomates that will develop into the anus. So again, once that open digestive tract forms, the original blastopore becomes the anus, the second opening becomes the mouth. And that's actually what the name deuterostomia means, is that the stomia means mouth, deutero means other, so they're saying that the other opening will become the mouth, not the blastopore. Okay, again, they are triploblastic, like all the animals that we've been talking about in the protostomia and so on, and also are eucoelomic, like most of the protostomates. Now, within the protostomia then, there are a number of phyla we need to discuss, and one of these are the echinoderms, the echinodermata. And the echinodermata, common name, are the spiny-skinned animals. And so this includes things like starfish and sea urchins, among others. Now, one of the really distinguishing features of the group is how they move. They move by means of tube feet. And again, I have an animation to show you this feature. And so this is an animation of a starfish, and this one's been turned upside down, so it has to use its tube feet to turn right side up. So again, you can see the tube feet here being extended. And this is part of what's known as a water vascular system, a water tubular system. And so at the end of the tube feet, there are tiny suctions, and so they can use muscle action to extend or retract these tube feet for movement. And of course, they can actually hold on pretty strongly as well. So again, when you see tube feet, you know you're talking about echinoderms. That's really diagnostic for the group. And then also, most members of the group, and again, this is a little diagram showing us, the inside and where the tube feet are generated internally. But again, it's part of a water vascular system, a water tubular system. And then lastly, they tend to show what we call pentamerous symmetry. And penta is a reference to 5. So they generally have appendages in multiples of 5 when appendages are present, and even internal organs in multiples of 5. So again, they're unique in that way. And again, in the case of a starfish, they have 5 arms typically, or multiples of 5 arms. So examples of echinoderms, classes of echinoderms, include the crinoids and feather stars. And here's an example of those. And those are often deep water organisms, marine organisms. Starfish, also called sea stars, that would be the class Asteroidea. And I think everyone's pretty familiar with starfish. Sea urchins and sand dollars in a class known as the Echinoidea. And again, they don't necessarily show the appendages, but again, they'll show us the tube feet, and also the tube feet typically are arranged in a pentamerous way as well. And then brittle and basket stars are in a class called the Ophiuroidea. And again, brittle stars are a very common tide pool animal if you've ever been along our coastlines. And then sea cucumbers, the Holothuroidea. And sea cucumbers don't really look like they fit that well with the rest of the group, because often when you look at a sea cucumber, it can look a lot like a sea slug. It can look, again, like a gastropod. But again, what you would look for if you weren't sure is that if it was a gastropod, a mollusk, it would be crawling on a broad muscular foot. And in the case of the sea cucumbers, they would be moving by means of tube feet. So again, tube feet puts you in the Echinodermata, and in this case, we're looking at a sea cucumber. Okay, and then that finally brings us to our own phylum, the phylum Chordata. And characteristics of the phylum Chordata include the following: a hollow dorsal spinal cord, or nerve cord. And I didn't mention this in the Protostomia, but when Protostomia have nerve cords, they're typically on the belly surface as opposed to the back surface, and that's what's meant by dorsal. And associated with that, nervous tissue can be kind of soft, especially a spinal cord, and so there has to be supporting tissue for that, and so that's known as, it'll be in one of two forms, either a notochord or a vertebral column. So notochord is a supporting rod of tissue that we generally find underneath the spinal cord, and a vertebral column would either be bone or cartilage that encapsulates and surrounds the spinal cord. So we'll come back to that a little bit later. And then also, members of the chordata exhibit pharyngeal clefts in their embryonic development. And in some cases, that may end up being gills and other structures. For example, our pharyngeal clefts in part develop into our jaws. So in kind of a generic looking chordate then, again, what we're looking at then is a hollow dorsal nerve cord. In this case, it's showing us a notochord supporting tissue, and pharyngeal clefts would be part of our development at some stage. Now, as we look at the phylum Chordata, there are 3 subphyla. One subphylum are the Urochordata, and the Urochordata are commonly called the tunicates or sea squirts. And when you look at an adult sea squirt, it really doesn't look anything like a chordate. You would never look at this and say, oh, that looks like a chordate. And it has these 2 siphons. Basically, it takes in water, runs it over a gill basket where it filter feeds. And the reason they're called sea squirts is that if you were to pick one up out of the water, and again, these are marine organisms, they tend to close up their valves. If you squeeze them, water will squirt out of those valves. So anyway, that's where the name comes from. Anyway, so again, by looking at the adult, you would never say that they are chordates, but where they exhibit their chordate characteristics are in their larval stages. And so again, they undergo a swimming larval stage that has the dorsal nerve cord, notochord, and pharyngeal clefts. It swims around, basically settles on its head, and then metamorphoses into the adult stage. And we haven't really taken time, and I won't have time to really talk about life cycles much here, but really all animals go, well, other than ourselves, but most animals that we've talked about go through some type of a metamorphosis in their life cycle. So you can look at larval stages, and they will look nothing like the adult stage. And it's difficult to figure out life cycles that way. Now, the next subphylum are the Cephalochordata, which basically means chordates with a head, although we all, of course, have heads at some stage. But anyway, the Cephalochordates, their common name would be lanceolets. And so they tend to kind of push themselves down into sediments or gravel, and then they'll filter feed. And so they're fish-like in appearance, but they're certainly not true fish. They just don't have the characteristics of fish. They don't have any kind of a skeletal system or organ systems like fish do. So again, here we're looking at a dorsal spinal nerve cord. We're looking at a notochord. And then again, they also exhibit pharyngeal clefts and gills. So again, this is a more classic-looking chordate. And then the last subphylum is, again, our own subphylum, which are the vertebrata. And the vertebrata have a vertebral column surrounding the spinal cord and also the cranium as well. And that will be composed of either bone or cartilage. So looking at vertebrates then, there are a number of vertebrate classes. And I'd like to go through some of the characteristics of these different vertebrate classes. So the first vertebrate class I'd like to discuss, and we're finally, of course, getting into some animals that you may be at least a little familiar with, although I'm not sure about the first group. But the first vertebrates to evolve, again, were marine organisms, a type of fish, and these are the Anatha. And so the term Anatha means without a jaw, the so-called jawless fishes. And so, again, these were the first vertebrates to evolve in the fossil record. They were very diverse at one time. And there are relatively few anathans still existing today. And so there's only a couple of types. One type is a hagfish, and you can see that the hagfish have kind of soft mouth parts. And hagfish tend to be detritivores. They'll basically kind of, they have a raspy tongue. They'll basically rasp their way into the insides of decaying organisms and pretty much eat them from the inside out. Or if they soften up as they decompose, then they can kind of slurp up the tissue that way as well. And hagfish produce a really noxious, slimy mucus if you ever try to handle them. Another anathan would be the lamprey. The lamprey is an ectoparasite of other fish. And so as you can see, from the fins and so on, both the hagfish and the lamprey are really not great swimmers, and they don't really have to be for their lifestyles. Basically, the lamprey just needs to be a good enough swimmer to latch onto a fish. And the lamprey has a series of disc-like teeth and then a rasp-like tongue. So again, it will attach to a fish, rasp through the soft tissue, and then feed on body fluids. Now, the anathans then were replaced in the fossil record by the Acanthodi, and the Acanthodi were the first of the jawed fishes. Now, the Acanthodi are all extinct currently, but again, at one time, they were the dominant vertebrate on the planet. And again, the Acanthodi were not very good swimmers, but they were heavily armored. They basically had an external armor plating, and again, had evolved jaws, and we see the jaws as evolving from the tissue that supported the gills of the anathan fish. So we think these so-called gill rakers. So anyway, so the anathans then basically replace the anathans in the fossil record, dominate, and then are replaced by, and in fact go extinct, and are replaced by the chondrichthyes. And so the term chondrichthyes, what it's trying to tell us about them is ichthyes is a reference to fish, chondr is a reference to cartilage, and these are the so-called cartilaginous fishes. Now I should say that, and that means that they have a cartilaginous skeleton. Now the anathans, and probably the Acanthodia as well, all had cartilaginous skeletons, so that's nothing particularly unique about them. But again, they are a living group and a dominant group. And so the chondrichthyes include both sharks and rays. And the chondrichthyes are much better swimmers, obviously, than what we see in either the Acanthodia or the anathans. And so again, we have much better developed fins, pectoral fins, pelvic fins, dorsal fin, anterior dorsal, posterior dorsal, and the caudal fin is the tail fin. So again, these guys are much better swimmers. They, again, take over basically in the fossil record and are a dominant animal. And also, the fusiform or torpedo body shape. They also have specialized teeth-like scales that help in movement of the water. And especially the pelagic forms or free-swimming forms also have very large livers, fatty livers, and that helps with some buoyancy and gives them more buoyancy than they would have otherwise, and that helps in resistance to swimming. So again, as we look at the chondrichthyes, we're mainly here talking about sharks, we're talking about rays, and then also something called the ratfish. And the ratfish is distinguished by, instead of having gill slits, basically has a covering known as an operculum and not a series of slits here. And also they lack the tooth-like scales that we find in the other chondrichthyes. Then osteichthyes evolved from chondrichthyes, and the osteichthyes are the bony fishes. So osteo is a reference to bone, ichthyes to fish. And again, this is really the most successful group of fishes on the planet, and again, at one time were the most advanced of the vertebrates. And so one of the advantages that the bony fishes have, of course, they have a bony skeleton, but they also have a gas-filled swim bladder or gas bladder in their internal cavity, in their coelom. And anyway, there are specialized blood vessels associated with this so that they can actually add gases, primarily oxygen, to the swim bladder or remove those. And so again, that helps with buoyancy. So the fish doesn't have to fight to stay at a certain place in the water column. It can just adjust the gases in the swim bladder to be able to basically float at a particular place in the water column. Also, again, osteichthyes have well-developed fins and really are the best swimmers. All of the fishes are cold-blooded, so-called endotherms. And in terms of their heart structure, they all have a two-chambered heart, although some make some slight modifications of that anatomy. And again, tremendously diverse group, tremendously successful group, and most of the fish that we eat are osteichthyes. They're also an important group because from the lobed fin fishes, a subgroup of the osteichthyes, the first terrestrial animals evolved. And so the first terrestrial animals to evolve are the amphibians. And again, we really see a lot of transitions. If you went back 40 years, we didn't have a lot of transitions between fish and amphibians, but we really do see a lot of transitional forms in the fossil record now, to the point where it's hard sometimes to tell whether you're looking at a fish or you're looking at an amphibian. And so amphibia then were the first terrestrial vertebrates to evolve. And so they move on to the land and dominate basically there because they have no competition. And so the amphibia include some orders, the Caudata, which are the salamanders, the Anura, which would include frogs and toads, and the Apoda, which are legless amphibians, basically salamanders. And so anyway, amphibians, of course, exhibit a metamorphosis where eggs are hatched in water. They go through a tadpole stage that has gills, and they eventually metamorphose into a terrestrial form. But they are completely dependent on water for reproduction. So they need water for egg development and also for respiration through their skin because their lungs are not particularly well developed. From the amphibia, reptilia evolved. And reptilia now are the first vertebrates which are really fully adapted for life on land. And so some of the important adaptations that we see in reptiles, which include things like lizards, snakes, turtles, and alligators, is the fact that they have what we call a keratinized skin. So keratin is a very hard protein. It's really the composition of our nails. But reptiles, birds, and mammals all exhibit keratinized skin. And so what that does is not only act essentially as an exoskeleton, but it also helps seal in water so that we don't lose so much water through our skin. Additionally, another important adaptation of the reptiles is that they have what's known as an amniote egg. And so the amniote egg is a fully self-contained egg for development on land. So they were no longer tied to water then for reproduction. They were able to reproduce on land. And again, that's a very important adaptation that allowed them then to move into drier habitats and exploit this extraordinary diversity of habitat. And so when you look at the amniote egg then, the egg white, which is basically the egg albumin, that's providing water for the developing embryo, and then the yolk is providing the food for the developing embryo. So again, the egg basically has a water source and a food source, and again, major adaptation for development on land. Reptilian orders include the Tuatara, which is lizard-like, but found primarily in New Zealand, and they have a couple of unique adaptations that lizards do not, so they're given their own order. The Squamata, which includes both lizards and snakes. Snakes evolved from lizards, and some snakes show us that ancestry by having remnants of pelvic bones. And also male anacondas actually have tiny appendages, little claws that they use for stimulating the female when they try to mate. And then the order Chelonia or Testudinata would include turtles and tortoises and all of that group. And then last but not least, the crocodilians. And so both amphibians and reptiles have three-chambered hearts, with the exception of the crocodilians. They actually have a four-chambered heart. But even with that kind of adaptation, reptiles, as well as amphibians, are also quote-unquote cold-blooded endothermic animals, which basically means that they can't really get enough oxygen to their tissues to be warm-blooded. And then we have the birds, aves, class aves. And aves have a four-chambered heart, which allows them to be endothermic homeotherms, which basically means warm-blooded. They also have a sternum that extends forward for muscle attachment, which permits flight. And they have an extraordinarily efficient lung and respiratory system. So flight requires a tremendous amount of oxygen, and so they have a lung that's adapted to allow for a one-way flow of air, and that will move opposite the direction of blood flow And that's a really efficient mechanism. It's called a countercurrent mechanism. And so it allows for maximum extraction of oxygen from the air. And again, they need that kind of efficiency for flight. Birds evolved from reptiles, actually from theropod dinosaurs. And again, we also see a lot of feathered dinosaurs as well. So this is an ancestry that is well established now. And again, tremendously diverse group and a successful group. And then last but not least, mammals. Characteristics of the mammals include having a four-chambered heart, like birds, although we evolved it independently. We are warm-blooded, endothermic homeotherms. We will have hair or fur, but really the distinguishing feature is mammary glands. And hair and fur is also derived from keratinized tissue. So scales of reptiles, hair of mammals, and feathers of birds are all derived from keratinized tissue. And then also, then we have a unique middle ear bone. So instead of having one middle ear bone like reptiles, we have three middle ear bones. And then also heterodontic means that we have different types of teeth in our mouth. Whereas reptiles will have only a single kind of tooth, we have different types of teeth in our mouth. And one of the things that you can do is look at a bird, for example, look at its beak and its feet, and you can usually figure out what it does in its ecosystem, what its function is in the ecosystem. And with mammals, you can usually look at the skull and the makeup of the teeth, and you can generally figure out what they do in the ecosystem. And then also, among the mammals, we have three subclasses. The monotremes, class Monotremata, which are the egg-laying mammals. And some people forget or don't realize that there are some mammals that are egg-laying, and they're found in Australia. And examples include the echidna, the spiny anteater, and also the duckbill platypus. And the other mammals then are placental mammals. And so there are two groups of placental mammals, the marsupials, which are the pouched mammals. And so marsupials have a very primitive placenta, and essentially they're bearing what amounts to an embryo. And the embryo finds its way up to a pouch, attaches itself to a teat, and then it feeds on milk there. And so, of course, both monotremes and marsupials are largely confined to Australia and related islands. And then, again, tremendous diversity here. They basically have filled the same niches that we find the true placentals filling in other ecosystems. And then the last subclass are the eutherians, the so-called true placentals, and of course that includes us. So eutherians eventually outcompeted marsupials and monotremes on all of the continents except for Australia. And I'll talk more about that in a supplement to this module. So that'll do it for today. See you next time.